Hello and welcome to another episode of Real Atheology. My name is Justin Schieber, and joining me on Skype is Real Atheology co-host Ben Watkins.
Hello, everyone.
So Ben and I are also joined by another human voice, Cory Markum. Cory is one half of the new podcast called Hinge. Cory, perhaps we could start off by you telling us a bit about yourself and a bit about this new podcast, The Hinge.
Sure. First, thanks for having me on here. It's a pleasure. As far as Hinge and what Hinge is and where it's coming from, I recently moved out to Philadelphia to work on this new program with a pastor friend of mine named Drew Sokol. It's going to be a podcast about an atheist and a pastor exploring together the historical figure Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, perhaps we might say. And so, in addition to having to do with history, textual criticism, things like that, it's also, of course, going to get into issues, just general issues pertaining to belief and doubt and faith, and the sort of things that will come up when an atheist and a pastor try to do something like that together. In addition, more and more, especially with the way our country right now is with the political divisiveness, more and more this podcast Hinge is also about us trying to put a model out there for how people can have conversations with people that they disagree with about matters of great importance, whether that's political, religious, or whatnot. So it's a podcast that it will consist of 10 sequential episodes. To get the full effect, you'll need to listen to them all in order. And it'll be at the end of the first season. It'll be over. So the 10th episode will be the conclusion, and that'll be the end of that. And it should, as of right now, we hope to start releasing the official episodes at the end of the year, right around Christmas time. Of course, not accidentally. It would be all too perfect if we could have the first one come out right around Christmas, obviously, as it's about Jesus. And so that's kind of what it's about. I should maybe say a little bit more about Drew. He's by far and away my favorite Christian to interact with, in that it's not just a matter of civil discourse, which I'm actually able to find quite often. It's more about this what I like to call epistemic humility. He has it in leaps and bounds. He's just particularly sensitive to the limitations that he has or that he had in getting to the point that he is right now with his views and whatnot. And so it's always refreshing when the two of us interact on a daily basis now as we're working on this podcast, just to see him. He continually challenges me, of course, but I challenge him. And even if it gets heated and we're not able to see the other's point in the moment, it happens all the time, or after the fact, we kind of come back and we're like, that was a really good point, what you brought up. And that really does make me, it really does make me question this particular aspect or whatever. So, it's a lot of fun. And it's also, I'm sure you guys like it, because it's just the idea of us having conversations with Christians is something that, I'm sure you guys agree we need to do more and more. So it's an awesome thing that we're doing at the moment.
Yeah. And for those listeners who like the kind of, this American lifestyle podcast, I think this is a nice addition to that kind of audio documentary kind of genre. You've got a couple episodes. I don't know if those are the official episodes, but you've got a couple out already under the title.
Well, to clarify, so we have it's funny because we didn't really foresee or really think about how hard this would be to explain, but basically right now, when I moved out to Philly, as we're making the podcast, we wanted a way to put some material out there in the meantime, both just for the people who have already expressed enthusiasm and for that matter who've supported us already. And honestly, just because we both what we're doing is just so much fun, and we just love it so much. It's just we want to put stuff out there, and so we kind of came up with the idea of doing sort of a runner-up podcast where it's called Hinge, the making of. It's on iTunes and other podcast mediums. And yeah, I mean, it in a way, it's a way for us to introduce some of the topics that we're going to get into in the official Hinge podcast at the end of the year, and also it's a way for us to start to introduce some of the guests that we're going to have on the show. So we're kind of having fun with it. It's very loosely formatted, like in contrast, say, to when we do the official Hinge podcast, which as you said is going to be a more or less a narrative form podcast that tells a story over the course of 10 episodes. And such a podcast obviously is going to have discussion too, but it's not going to be, just so everyone's clear, it's not going to be kind of the typical discussion based podcasts that are common and that already are doing this job of talking about religion and this kind of stuff really well, like your guys' show, for instance.
You, Cory, and Ben had an interesting discussion about a week ago on moral realism and your guys' kind of differing opinions on this. So whereas you both are atheists, you both believe that God does not exist, you guys have a disagreement, at least on some level, about the nature of moral facts. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to have you on, Cory, to kind of go have a back and forth with Ben, who is super into these issues. And so I'm just going to pretty much take a back seat and let this discussion continue, and perhaps giving a bit of context for the discussion in the first place would be a good place to start.
I guess to give some background, we kind of got on this topic because we ended up on Jonathan McClatchy's show together, and we were discussing the moral argument, or the moral argument was the topic of discussion. And for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a theist will appeal to objective moral truths. They'll usually say something like objective moral values or objective moral duties. And if you grant that premise, then the move from the theist is, okay, you couldn't have these sort of moral truths unless there was a God, unless there was some divine commander. Sometimes they'll defend this premise by appealing to Dostoevsky and saying if God is dead, then all is permitted. And the premise basically goes, if God does not, it's a conditional premise that says if God does not exist, then there are no objective moral truths. They usually say objective moral values and duties. And so that the antecedent of that conditional claim is supposed to be sufficient for the consequence. So basically, it's saying that atheism implies some form of moral nihilism. And so if you accept that claim, then you accept that claim and you accept the claim that there are these moral truths, then you have a deductively valid argument to the existence of God.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, just real simply, just to give a bullet point version, right? Like, so premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise two, but objective moral values do exist, and then therefore the conclusion, hence God exists. So yeah, but.
And so we could probably unpack the distinction there between moral values and moral duties.
I suppose my problem is that I have trouble divorcing the two sometimes when I really try to, and hence my skepticism. So
a value statement is going to be an evaluative claim. So if I say that something is good and bad, or virtuous or vicious, those are evaluative claims. So those are the things that, like, suffering is in itself bad, happiness is in itself good. These are evaluative claims. But if I were to make a claim about things that you should do, in the sense that all the other options that you have would be wrong, when I use terms like right and wrong, I'm talking about duties, moral duties and obligations. So this is what morality requires of us. One of the great ways to think about this distinction is to say it's a good thing if I become a doctor. That's a good thing in the world. I've added value to the world, but I'm not morally obligated to become a doctor. Morality doesn't require of me to go to medical school and become a doctor. And so one of the areas where atheists can disagree with how to approach this argument is if you deny the first step, if you don't concede to a theist that there are these objective moral truths, then the argument is unsound. because you could just defend some sort of anti-realist position about moral claims, something like non-cognitivism or nihilism. But I think that route is mistaken. I think that we should grant that part of the argument, that there are objective moral truths. I think that we should instead attack the first premise that says that atheism implies some form of moral nihilism. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and objective moral duties do not exist. And so I think that's an area where Cory and I have a lot of common ground, but we also find room for disagreement.
Yeah. And we definitely I think we're right on the same page with respect to the first premise and this idea. We're both pretty much convinced that it's not the case that basically that atheism entails moral nihilism, to put it in the simplest way possible. And so, like you said, it's more the second premise, whether or not there actually is objective moral values. That's where really it's where I sort of get hung up on. And I suppose my concern in one sense is just that I'm not sure what we mean by objective, and I think that depending on the philosopher or the theologian, when they say objective moral values, I can sort of agree with that. I think those do exist, but then if they other definitions of objectivity, obviously I'm not so much on board with. And so what I'm curious is, maybe Benjamin, if you could unpack even more specifically what you mean when you say objective moral truths, and then we can see whether I actually agree or not. And then perhaps what I'm hoping to get out of this is I would like to be convinced of moral realism, in the sense that you mean it. I really would. It's funny because it's not just, I don't say that in a facetious manner. Like it would be, subjectively speaking, right? I think it would be much better. The world would be much better if I could. Or if there were objective moral values, and I'm just not entirely convinced of it. I suppose you could say I'm somewhat of an agnostic on this matter, which is, although I don't normally hear that.
Fair enough. I think that's a fair position, because I think that a lot of these questions that are raised in ethics, and particularly in meta-ethics, are difficult questions. These are questions that require time and thought, and we can't just intuit our way through it. So I think taking an agnostic approach to it is quite commendable, instead of just saying, no, I don't think there are these sorts of things, or saying, yes, I think there are these sorts of things, but I don't know how to defend that. So you even mean it in an objective sense when you think that's commendable. So I really I think that we have reasons, normative reasons to believe that. In my version of what we can call normative realism, my views are very much in line with Derek Parfit's and Thomas Nagel and Eric Wielenberg and several other normative realists, in that we believe that there are these objective moral truths. And so Cory asked, well, what are we bringing on when we say objective moral truths? And I think that's exactly the right place to start this discussion, because the objective-subjective divide in philosophy can be a very large shade of gray. And so you've got to be very precise about what you're saying with, because these can be nebulous terms. When I say that a truth, just any truth, not just a moral truth, when I say that any truth is objective, I mean that it's not subjective. So that definition doesn't carry any weight unless we then define subjective that's not in the same terms as using the word objective. So I think that a truth is subjective if it constituently depends on the attitudes, dispositions, or responses of observers or subjects. That's what would make it subjectivist. So if I say that Jon Stewart is funny, I'm saying a subjective truth about Jon Stewart. If no one thought that Jon Stewart was funny, then it wouldn't be true that Jon Stewart was funny. Now, if I said that squares have four sides, that's an objective truth. It doesn't matter what the attitudes or responses or dispositions or beliefs of any observers are. Squares have four sides. So that's how we can distinguish an objective truth from a subjective truth. So when I make certain moral claims like suffering is in itself bad, wanton cruelty is wrong, I'm saying that these statements can, in the strongest sense, be true, but their truth does not depend on the attitudes, responses, or dispositions of observers or subjects, either divine or human. No subject.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think that's a great. This is part of the difficulty, I think, is because so far, just by this definition, I'm not so sure that I basically I think I'm right there with you, and I would call myself a moral realist, and because I do think that in the very least we can get to what we might call moral truths that do not depend on that. Basically on the attitudes or opinions of individuals in the way that you're laying out there. And I suppose my concern is I'm still not sure that it's almost, I guess it has to do with some philosophers, as you know, I mean, you're probably better about pointing them out. Some of them would reject this need for there being some sort of metaphysical foundation of the type that we're talking about, and still say that, you know, that doesn't mean that we can't get to objective moral truths. And I suppose another concern of mine is that it seems to me that in this system of yours that there is, and perhaps you could just answer this directly, there does seem to be some aspect of your system that is in some way based on your attitudes or opinions, and really what I'm referring to is sort of at the heart, a crux of your system. There are going to be these certain axioms or moral assumptions, moral principles that you have there that, as you know full well, that they're not obviously true. And yeah, I suppose maybe start there. And so, what would you agree that there, at least in some way, that this does go back to your attitudes or opinions with respect to the moral assumptions and principles, or is there some way to get around that by your understanding?
Well, so I don't know if I'm entirely sure I'm understanding you, but well, stop me if I lose you. I would not say that these truths depend on me in any way, so that if humanity were to cease to exist, it would still be true that wanton cruelty was wrong, and it would still be true that suffering was in itself bad. But now I do have to have an epistemological element to this. I have to say, okay, how do I know these sorts of truths? How do I have access to these sorts of truths? And so I would appeal then to what Michael Huemer calls rational intuition. So I think, and maybe this is what you were saying earlier, and I would agree with it, that at some level we have to take certain judgments at face value and say, okay, this is what explanation comes to an end somewhere. So we're basically at the bottom, at the philosophical bedrock of any of our systems are going to have to be principles or axioms that themselves are not derived from other truths. They are self-evident, and we take them on and are prima facie justified in doing so. Things like we have veridical sense experience from the external world. We just take that for granted. Our systems at the bottom say, okay, it seems to us that our senses give us reliable information about the external world, so we take that to be true. Our memory experiences are another. We say, okay, well, my memories are reliable. They're giving me information about past events that really happened. And so I think just like mathematical, logical, and modal intuitions, we can have normative intuitions about what we have reasons to believe, what reasons we have to perform certain actions, and what reasons we have to have certain desires or attitudes or goals. So I take a view that either there are these irreducibly normative truths or nothing matters. And that's kind of a bold claim, but I think I think that's true. I think that if we don't have any reasons to have the desires that we do have, then nothing really matters. Reason can't help us. We're basically in the dark on what we ought to do. Instead of when Socrates poses his question, how ought we live? What ought we do? The subjectivists have to say, they have to change that question. They have to say, what do I most want? And that's all that can get. And to me, that's the equivalent of nihilism. And so I think there are these irreducibly normative truths. I think so. My thesis that I'm defending is that some things matter in the sense that we have reasons to care about them for their own sake. Things like the suffering of humanity, things like people's happiness, things like people's freedom. So I think these are things that are good in a reason-implying sense, in the sense that the very nature of these things give us reasons to care about them for their own sake.
So there's a lot of directions that I could go with this. One thing, I certainly am with you on the distinguishing between ontology and epistemology. So what we know to be the case and what actually is the case. And basically, I still don't really, I'm still not sure as to what makes a given thing, or what makes what gives these things their objectivity. I mean, you basically, if I understand you correctly, you sort of just made an appeal to the brute facts, or to a sort of brute facts basis where you at some level, at the heart of it, you really do just sort of have to take these things at face value, certain moral assumptions and moral principles, and then you basically just said that that's justifiable, though, because we do something similar with respect to logic and other sort of normative systems like that. And I guess one question would be: do you really think that that it is on par, our inability to justify moral systems with our inability to justify logic and those kind of things? Because just intuitively, that seems off to me. Like it seems there's more basis, say, to put stock in some of the suppositions at like the heart of logic, say, than there is with respect to like the moral sphere. I mean, does that make rather than say a bunch of things? I think I'm going to try to do point by point.
I think this is a great place to start, because so when I say that they're irreducibly normative truths, what do I mean? Well, I mean that these truths are irreducible, meaning that they can't be reduced to a truth of some other kind. They're in their own non-overlapping category. They're not a mathematical fact. They're not a natural fact. They're not a modal fact. These are normative
moral
facts.
Yeah.
Correct. Moral facts. Moral fact is a type of normative fact, but there are also epistemic facts about reasons. So we can pick up right there where I say, okay, if I can demonstrate the existence of at least one irreducibly normative truth, that resolves some of the worries that you have. Because you're probably worried about, well, are there these irreducibly normative truths? And so, is that right or wrong?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's part of the concern.
Excellent.
And they seem, and I hate to say it, I hate to be that guy, but they do seem. I'm not beholden to metaphysical naturalism, but I do get wary the more abstract, and I mean it gets really close to the sort of things that people would otherwise refer to as supernatural or something like that. But anyway, please continue. I think that's fair what you said.
Yeah. So this is great. I like where this conversation's going, because I think your worry is common among many thinkers, and I think it's a worry that we can resolve our differences on. And so let's take the example of having a valid argument. So that's a modal claim. We're going to say that some argument is valid and has true premises, such that its conclusion must be true. That's a modal claim. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in every possible world, this argument with its true premises will always yield this true conclusion. So I would make the normative claim then that we all have reason to accept that conclusion. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
That is an irreducibly normative claim. There's your irreducibly normative truth about epistemic reasons, about what we have most reason to believe. So right there, so I think it's very difficult to avoid that argument, to then say, no, we don't all have a reason to believe that conclusion. That to me seems absurd. And so
I'm with you. I'm with you, but like help me connect the dots.
Yeah. So then people's worry is, okay, well, I've got this irreducibly normative truth that I agree with, that just seems too obvious to dismiss. Well, what does that commit me to? I think this is where apologists have been successful in hoodwinking atheists in a sense of thinking that these sorts of truths have some sort of ontologically weighty implications. That these truths can only be true because they correspond to some part of reality. And so all of a sudden there's these mysterious metaphysical entities free-floating in the world that we somehow have epistemic access to. Have you noticed that? Is that that kind of describes a concern? Well, so I say that these truths don't have any ontologically weighty implications, meaning that these truths aren't made true by how they correspond to some part of reality, whether in the natural world or some non-spatio-temporal Platonic realm. These truths can just be true in their own right, just like mathematical truths, just like logical truths, and just like modal truths. So modal claims aren't made true by how they correspond to some part of reality. They're not even part of reality. They're possible worlds that don't even exist. So they aren't made true by how they correspond to some part of reality. Arithmetical truths, like there's an infinite number of prime numbers greater than 100. That's not referring to anything in the world.
Yeah.
So we're not committed to anything. Mathematicians shouldn't worry that their mathematical theories will unravel because there aren't these entities called numbers as part of reality for these claims to correspond to. And so similarly, ethicists shouldn't worry about their moral claims not being true, and atheists shouldn't worry about their moral claims not being true because there aren't these ontologically weighty, irreducibly normative truths. Once you get rid of those metaphysical assumptions, then you're fine. So the normative realist doesn't disagree with the metaphysical naturalist about the contents of the universe. What they disagree with them about is the order of normative explanation. They think that value terminates in itself. Value statements aren't made true by something else. The subjectivist wants to explain those truths in terms of some possible desire of some possible agent. The realist says no. They reject that whole approach and they reverse it. They think that it's not us that gives things value. Our attitudes and desires can correspond to actual value and come to decisions to make certain actions by responding to reasons. So at the heart of this is Plato's assumption that man is a rational animal, that we have the ability to respond and be aware of reasons to have certain beliefs, like the conclusion earlier, or to have certain desires, or to perform certain actions. And those don't have any metaphysically weighty implications.
Yeah, man. So obviously, a lot of this is not stuff. It's stuff that I'm gonna have to process, and I'm not gonna be able to just, to give you a rebuttal or necessarily accept. Because even if so much of what you're saying does make sense, I still get caught up on my own. On perhaps that just being a misunderstanding on my part, and also the fact that I want this to be so is also on my my mind and with respect to that too. But
excellent.
So one thing you said, I wrote this down when you said that something matters, insofar that we have reason to care about it for its own sake. Is that right?
Yes.
Was that
yes?
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So something matters insofar that we have reason to care about it for its own sake. And now you also said that obviously normativity isn't restricted to morality. So like there are epistemological normative claims and stuff like that too. I suppose I still it seems almost too easy. Maybe that's one way to voice my concern. It seems like it's almost like, the way you're laying it out, it's so straightforward and simple. It's hard for me to think that all of the minds before myself, far more intelligent than myself, looking in these issues, that they somehow just dropped the ball and didn't see how simple it was, and so. Yeah, I don't know. I suppose just the idea that we have reason to care about something for its own sake, that being enough to get us to more realism. I'm still caught up on that, and maybe for its own sake, maybe if you could unload that a little bit more too. So, are you kind of saying there that there are certain things that are just intrinsically valuable?
Sure.
In their own right.
Intrinsic value. Yeah, intrinsic value is something that's very important to my conception of my ethical system. So for the listeners, to explain that a little bit further, there's a distinction between intrinsic value and extrinsic value. And so an intrinsic value is something that's valuable in and of itself. It's not made valuable by something else. That would be something of extrinsic value. Something like money is of extrinsic value. In itself, it's not worth anything. It's just a piece of paper or a coin or code in your debit card. But something like happiness would be of intrinsic value. It's something that would be an end in and of itself, something that you're not trying to obtain it in order to get something of greater value. And so one of the easiest places to see these sorts of things is when we take our basic intuitions of pain and pleasure. And so we can say that pain and pleasure are of intrinsic value. Obviously, in opposite ways, we want to pursue pleasure and we want to avoid pain. But sometimes pain is instrumental or extrinsic in getting higher order goods. So I may have a toothache that's really unhealthy for me, that's bad for me. It does not consist as part of my well-being. I can go get that fixed having healthy teeth, which is good. It's something that consists in part of my well-being. So the pain that the dentist inflicts on me is instrumental or extrinsic value to me because it allows me to achieve this higher ordered good. Well, eventually, all extrinsic goods terminate in something intrinsically good. And if there's nothing intrinsically good in the world, then it doesn't matter. Everything's of extrinsic value and nothing matters because you could at bottom have anything. One of your aims could be torturing people. If torturing people is not wrong in itself, then it doesn't matter if that's my aim. And so I'm appealing to the concept of a purely normative reason. And so this is the part where when I say that some things matter for their own matter in the reason implying sense, what I mean is that some facts is a reason or gives us a reason when that fact counts in favor of having some belief or desire or acting in some way. So a doctor whose patient's grimacing, that's a reason for the doctor to believe that his patient is in pain. The fact that she is in pain gives the doctor a reason to do something about the pain. It's the fact that the patient's in pain, not anything about the doctor's desires are relevant in this reason implying sense. He has reasons to care about the pain for its own sake.
Yeah, so I'm with you on that. It's clear that that's not it's not a subjective matter, because it really does boil down to the fact that she is experiencing pain, which is something that's happening in the world, I suppose. But I still don't like what. Take pain, for instance, right? Why is pain intrinsically bad?
There would be no. You've hit philosophical bedrock.
Yeah. Okay, so that gets back to that, and I think, I suppose, if the argument is that this is just unavoidable, insofar that we're doing the game of moral realism, and so it's fair game, then that's one thing. But I don't. That just doesn't seem obvious to me. Like, I don't, it isn't persuasive, maybe is the better point. Like, it's not obvious. Okay, whatever. But it's not persuasive.
Let's use the more obvious example. Okay. Let's go back to the epistemic argument where I said you ought to believe the conclusion.
Well, if we can, actually, I hate to do it. If we could, honestly, it will be much more helpful if you could literally if we could focus on like pain, something like really straightforward, right? Like,
well, yeah, I'm coming back to that because you said what makes pain bad. Okay, so and I said there is no further answer to that, and you think that seems too easy. So I'm saying hold that in your mind for a second, because then we take the example of the argument with the valid argument with true premises. What if you were to then ask for that question, but why should I accept the conclusion? There is no answer to that question, is there? The fact that the argument was valid and had true premises was the reason for you to accept it. There was no further, but okay, I accept that it has valid premises, or it's a valid argument and it has true premises, but why should, what makes it that I should believe this conclusion? I don't think that question has any answer.
Doesn't make sense. Yeah.
And so I don't think what makes pain bad, I think doesn't make sense in the same way that other one doesn't make sense. Because it's not the case, like not even an omnipotent God could make it the case that pain was intrinsically good, that we all had reasons to pursue pain for its own sake. Not even an omnipotent God.
I guess I still not even.
For the same reason that he couldn't make it the case that you shouldn't believe the conclusion that of the argument that was valid and had true premises. It's a necessary truth. That's just the way it is. That's you've hit philosophical bedrock with the spade of a meaningless question.
I lost Sam Harris.
and so this is a part. I'm glad you mentioned Sam Harris, because this is a part where he should have just come out and said this about his moral theory. He's just saying, look, right. He thinks that the greatest possible misery for everyone is bad.
It's philosophical,
It's bad, and he says if that's not bad, then no. And I think he's right. I think when you say the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, he's saying something true, but he's saying a necessary truth. That's the ground of his system. If you were to say, yeah, but why is that bad? Why is the worst possible misery for everyone bad? But there's no answer to that question. It's a bad question.
Yeah, perhaps. Oh, Benjamin. I don't know. I hear you. I'm with you, but I still not. I guess I suppose part of the problem is I probably don't follow you perfectly with the first the first little argument that you're giving, and I know you gave that before I saw it on Facebook, and it made more sense to me at that point. But
which one, the agony argument, or
no, the analogy that you keep drawing between that valid argument and
the valid argument with true premises, yeah. So I think that argument's useful in establishing the existence of an irreducibly normative truth, because that also undercuts any of the metaphysical objections that people might bring to moral realism and say, look, these irreducibly normative truths are too queer to be part of the fabric of the universe, as J.L. Mackie famously said.
Right.
I think you can avoid those objections entirely by saying, no, look, there are these irreducibly normative truths, and they don't have any ontologically weighty implications.
Well, so okay. So let's say that does get you out of that initial objection. How do we then? It doesn't seem to me that it follows from that there are these irreducibly normative moral truths.
No,
so you've established.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So maybe we can just go. Let's just leave that aside and say that I think that's well said, and I'll think about that later. And then maybe let's go beyond that. Then fair enough. Let's just say we have a good objection to the theist or the atheist that has that concern about the metaphysical stuff. But so yeah, like you said, how do we then get to these irreducibly normative moral truths? We've established that there's at least one with respect to epistemology, and so that gets rid of that concern. But then now what?
Now comes the part where we've got our meta-ethical foundation now. So now what we need is a normative view, a view about what we ought to do. Now that we've established what it means when we say that some act is good in the reason implying sense, or that some act is wrong, once we're putting those in terms of reasons, we can then start putting forward moral principles about what we should actually do. And so there's this irreducibly normative aspect of moral language too. This Derek Parfit uses the phrase, "this mustn't be done-ness" to these sorts of claims. So moral claims are overriding, they're categorical. So you're not going to have some consideration that would outweigh a moral claim. Does that make sense? Maybe another moral claim, but you're not going to have some other claim that's going to override. And so this is basically finding the bedrock of our now normative claims. And so there's just different versions of ways you can hash that out. And I believe you defended it on Tyler Vela's show, Shelley Kagan's contractualist formulation. Yeah. And so his is very similar to Scanlon's, which I more sympathize with, which says that an act is wrong just when and because such acts are disallowed by some principle that no one could reasonably reject. So let's take the principle, do not disable people. That's a general rule. That's obviously not an absolute rule. We might need to amputate someone's limb in order to save their life. In certain
circumstances, right?
Exactly. So, but these are So, a principle for the general regulation of behavior, something like "do not disable other people." That's not a principle that anyone could, in the reason sense that I've been saying, could object to, could give a reasonable objection to. And so I think this view lines up with what's called rule consequentialism, which says that we ought to act on the principles whose acceptance would make things go best. So the principles that no one could reasonably reject just are those principles that would make things go best. No one could reject two sets of rules that would make things go best. So you could start adding more rules and principles to your normative views. Things like do not, kill, do not deprive of freedom, keep your promises, do your duty, obey the law. These are all things that you can see are, in a strong sense, true because they can't reasonably be rejected. And they are those principles that would make things go best. So it follows these are the principles we ought to follow in the reason implying sense, meaning we have the most reason to take these principles as our overriding aims. So even if there is no God, and by the way, God would be constrained by this too. He couldn't issue commands that no one could reasonably reject, moral commands. He couldn't make any, he couldn't give laws to all people that people could reasonably reject to. Do you see that? Or that wouldn't make things go best. God would still be constrained by this. He wouldn't have to create it. It wouldn't be contingent on God. God would be constrained by this as well.
Yeah. You know, I one thing that I always think about when we get into these issues is like, I certainly find it interesting, but I do wonder how much pragmatic value it has. And so what I think of is Sam Harris, when he got into his moral landscape, he usually starts the talks, or his, like the book, for instance, talking about like the moral degradation going on in society, and how he thinks it's a concern that more and more people are, you know, that essentially that they're sort of rejecting moral realism, and I would assume that you would agree with him. Would that be spot on? Is that a concern of yours?
Well, it is, in the sense that I think what the postmodernists have done is, in a very real sense, evil, in saying, you know, that truth is relative and that these sorts of things don't matter. And so I think that there's a very real wave of postmodern moral relativism that is pervasive in the populace, that I think is very toxic to moral progress. So I think so as a realist, I think moral progress is real. So I think, you know, overcoming slavery and women's suffrage and civil rights, these are all parts of moral progress. Subjectivists have a very difficult time making those sorts of claims.
Yeah.
Because nothing matters.
I guess, right. Yeah, I guess I just mean that, like, it seems like if we're gonna spend our time on this earth doing things, you know, I think it would be better suited to, you know, work more maybe in the realm of like applied ethics and things like that. And I suppose it's because, like, I like to imagine the future where the famous Benjamin philosopher I'm sure you'll be, that you successfully prove the objectivity of moral values, or, you know, or moral realism. And then I wonder, like, what would change? Like, and I don't think, you know, like, it's like rapists aren't going to start refraining from raping because someone just,
I don't think you would have any kind of
and so
like no.
and obviously you don't. But anyway, I sometimes when I get caught up in this stuff, it's so interesting, and but it almost feels like almost too academic if you like, get down back to the earth and think about the sort of the stuff that's going on. And I don't, you know, the part of the problem, I think, is like someone will come at me and like, how do you, like, I don't know how to convince someone that doesn't already have, say, empathy, or doesn't already value certain things like happiness. I don't know how to convince them to, and I'm not sure that it is a way.
No, you can't, because morality is one of those things that that you take on the principles that you believe are true. So remember, these are our overriding factors. So if someone has different overriding factors, like the commands of God, you're probably not going to be able to convince that person. That person's going to have to convince themselves. They're going to have to weigh the arguments. And I you know, maybe this is my own pessimism, but I just think some people aren't wired that way. Some people just don't have the capacities to examine their beliefs critically. But I think there's another side to this coin, in that this is where I think academia the problem is in academia. It's only someone that's been to university that would challenge in this abstract way that there are no moral truths. So, you know, prior to being opposed to apologetics or philosophy, most people would say, yeah, some things matter for their own sake. Yeah, like pain is bad, pleasure is good, and move on with their life. They would just live, they would just keep living on without thinking much of that. I think it takes an overly skeptical mind to then try to undermine those claims. But I think one of the real tensions in academia has stemmed from what I call a lithic realism and naturalism about reality. And so I guess I should define these. So a lithic realism says that all true claims are made to be true by the way in which these claims correctly describe or correspond to how some things are in some part of reality. And then naturalism about reality is the belief that the natural spatio-temporal world is the whole of reality. And so I think those two theses, rough theses, combined together are what people like yourself have, they combine and make this alethic naturalism where all truths are about natural facts. And so if these irreducibly normative truths aren't natural facts, well, then they just can't exist. And I think that's the mistake. I think that's where once logical positivism started to recede, there were still these quasi-realists and ethical subjectivists that still persisted on. And we're just now getting to the point where all of that is fading away. Peter Singer has since moved into the objectivist camp.
Yeah, I saw that recently, yeah.
Yeah, and so Alan Gibbard, one of the predominant quasi-realist expressivists, a well-known anti-realist, has changed his views on this. Peter Railton was a ethical naturalist who has since changed his mind. Shelley Kagan has come on to this.
So the naturalist, where he changed his mind to being a sort of normative realism, essentially. Irreducible.
So Peter Railton believed that we have to make irreducibly normative claims when we make moral claims. But when these claims are true, they refer to natural facts.
Right.
So let's take a simple example and just take hedonistic utilitarianism as an example, which is the view that we ought to do whatever would benefit most people's pleasure. And so he would say an act, when we say that some act is wrong, or when we say that some act is right, we're saying that it's maximizing pleasure. Well, maximizing pleasure is a natural fact. But I think that's mistaken. I don't think that irreducibly normative claims can refer to just natural facts. I think it requires the fact that I will run over a dog is the fact that makes it the case that I should step on my brakes. But there's a more general truth, a non-natural truth that says I shouldn't cause unnecessary harm to another sentient being. That doesn't reduce to the natural fact. Correct. But that truth is what licenses that inference to say that this natural fact, that if I don't step on my brakes, I'll run over this dog. That's a natural fact. That fact counts in favor of me stepping on my brakes. You've got to have there's a piece missing. There's a premise missing, and that premise is you shouldn't cause unnecessary harm to another sentient creature. That's the non-natural claim. And so Railton was hesitant to accept these claims because he thought they had these ontologically weighty implications, and he didn't want to add weird things to his ontology. Well, when he started conversing with Derek Parfit and they came up, with their latest book, they realized, oh, well, if these claims don't commit me to anything ontologically weighty, both Railton and Gibbard said, we're willing to accept these claims. And so now Derek Parfit, Railton, and Gibbard have resolved their differences. They all have the same normative beliefs.
Yeah, and is that part of Parfit's project to try to show that many of these seemingly distinct views are actually more or less saying the same thing in different languages? Is that right?
So he uses the analogy they're climbing the same mountain from different sides.
It's so much more poetic.
Yeah. And so he originally used that in his volume 2 because he did this with normative claims. Remember how I said earlier that the contractualist view and the rule consequentialist view overlapped? Well, he thinks there's a third view, a Kantian view, that moral principles are the principles that everyone can universalizably will.
Categorically imperative, yeah.
Yeah, so the principles that everyone can rationally will just are the principles that make things go best, which just are the principles that no one could reasonably reject. So he says that the Kantians and the consequentialists and the contractualists are all climbing the same mountain from different sides. So then he did the same thing in metaethics. He said, look, the ethical non-naturalists, the ethical naturalists, and the quasi-realist expressivists are all climbing the same mountain from different sides.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like Justin is sort of in the background, not saying anything, and then I'm sort of like in the middle where I'm saying a few words here and there, and then Benjamin is just teaching us all this wisdom about.
I'm just soaking it up.
Yeah, and I'm trying to too, and I'm trying to at the same time come up with objections, but at the same time I'm trying to not do that because I want to be open and I want to be able to accept this. And you've covered
do is to ask questions for now instead of worrying about something right now or trying to come up with objections. Ask questions because even if in the end you don't end up accepting this view, you'll have a great understanding of a meta-ethical view, and you'll have a huge a way of thinking about this conceptual space better.
Yeah. Well, speaking of questions, Benjamin, we spent most of this discussion in the realm of moral ontology and like the nature and foundation of moral value and obligations. And I suppose why don't we go into epistemology, moral epistemology, and obviously another possible concern of mine and a concern that has been raised by many people over the years is just how do we as these primates with a particularly complex frontal lobe, how do we actually know for sure that we're getting to moral truths? And is it just a matter of what's intuitively the case for us? So
I would say that it starts with rational intuition, but just like in mathematics and logic, we take those initial seemings and then we test them. We conduct thought experiments and we push these concepts to their conceptual limits to see what we can usefully take away from these sorts of things.
So just to be clear then, so we're doing like a conceptual as opposed to like an empirical testing, right?
Absolutely. So I don't think that there can be empirical evidence for or against these irreducibly normative truths. There's no experiment that I can perform that's going to confirm or deny that we all have reason to care about agony. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And so just like in mathematics, we would say, okay, well, let's start with this sort of formula. And, this axiom seems self-evident. What are the consequences of it? Do we come with any tensions in any other beliefs? And if so, then we give this up. And you see what I'm saying? Because this is how utilitarianism has evolved over the years. People say, look, it just seems obvious that pain and pleasure, those are the things that are of intrinsic value. But then thought experiments like trolley dilemmas have come around and have really tested really strained those intuitions. And we've gone, okay, maybe we need to revise our views some more. And so it's definitely a realm of pure philosophy in the sense that it's going to be taking those basic rational intuitions and pushing them to their limits and seeing what can withstand objections and scrutiny and where we can make progress.
Yeah. So would you say, I could be just dead wrong about this, but it seems to me that there would be some sort of empirical demonstrability when it comes to mathematics. And so, do you think am I wrong about that? Am I misunderstanding you, there's a sort of empirical demonstrability with mathematics that you don't seem to find with ethics, where, like you said, there really isn't any sort of measure. There's nothing. Whereas I do think there's more than just numbers. Say with mathematics, we can measure, right? We can use that in the world, and we can make predictions. For instance,
that's where these fields are relevantly different in the sense that mathematics is quantitative, where ethics is more qualitative. So it's a different language game in that sense. But pure mathematics, like arithmetic, that's not an empirical endeavor at all. So that's what I would compare it to. Not applied mathematics, where you would go out into the a posteriori mathematics. This is well within the realm of a priori knowledge. So I think one of a good example is principles of logic, or modal claims, our claims about necessity and possibility. So it's merely possible that I own a pair of orange socks. I don't actually own a pair of orange socks, but it is merely possible. And so that's an intuition. That's a modal intuition. I'm saying, look, that orange socks have this property of possibly being owned by me. And so, but that doesn't commit me to any ontologically weird things, and I don't have any epistemological problems with it. If you're going to say, well, there's epistemological objections to these normative claims, well, then you'd have to also throw out these modal claims and these mathematical claims and these logical claims. And I think you've thrown the baby out with the bathwater at that point.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to throw any babies anywhere, so that's an
irreducibly normative claim.
I don't. Oh gosh. Another problem I'm worried about is ultimately this does seem to boil down to intuitions, and needless to say, intuitions differ quite radically. And so this is almost a cliche concern or objection to moral realism at this point. But since we're talking about a moral epistemology, I would be curious to kind of see what you think about the fact that we have such widespread diversity when it comes to our moral intuitions. And I mean, is that a concern? If not, why isn't it a concern for you?
So I think it's certainly a prima facie concern. So it's one of those concerns that would require ethicists to address. And I would agree that there is widespread disagreement about particular moral issues, about issues like abortion. But I don't think that there is widespread disagreement on basic moral truths. Things like don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat, don't disable, don't deprive of freedom. These are all moral judgments that I think are fairly universal. And when they're not, we consider someone like that to have some sort of cognitive impairment, whether they be, psychopathic, sociopathic, or just not even a rational agent at all. They might be someone who just chronically hurts themselves uncontrollably, almost like Tourette's. We wouldn't consider that person morally culpable for their actions. But I think that there is, on the whole, widespread moral agreement. And I would also make a stronger claim, which I would have to get in more argumentation for. But I think that if we all had the same normative concepts, if we were all using the same normative concepts and were raised in sufficiently similar environments, we would all have sufficiently similar normative beliefs. So I think where a lot of different disagreement comes in is people using the wrong normative concepts. And I'm going to call out theists right here now who defend forms of divine command theory. If they think that reasons are given by commands instead of by facts, that's where you're going to get ethical disagreement, because they're using different concepts. And when you use different concepts, you're going to arrive at different conclusions. And that's why people have a hard time. That's one of the very powerful objections to divine command theory is, which command do we listen to? So many people are claiming so many different kinds of commands.
Yeah.
And so I take the sting out of that objection by saying, look, there is widespread agreement about basic moral truths, and that we can explain this disagreement by differing cultures and differing normative concepts. And so that, I think that sufficiently
explains it and shows why it doesn't undermine it.
So since our intuitions differ, I think I'm the person that's more likely to be getting things right, because I can give this explanation of why it is that I'm right and why it is someone else has made some sort of mistake.
Yeah, so I have a moral intuition of my own that I would like to kind of hear what you think about, and it's something I got from Sam Harris and his moral landscape. And basically, it's not just the fact that he says, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. I'm with him on that. I think that makes sense. But I think there's even a deeper, more fundamental moral intuition there, and it's basically this concern with well-being and suffering. Yeah. And even more than that, if you keep pushing back, I think it goes to it's like a prerequisite, is maybe the way I would put it, for any sort of moral evaluation or any sort of morality, that there be minds, things capable of experiencing, and to the extent that it seems to me that if we imagine a universe without if it's literally a universe just comprised of chemicals and rocks, say, it seems to me that would be, not only would that be a world without morality, but it would be a world or circumstances where morality would be impossible. It doesn't even make sense. It's incoherent.
That's because it's a world without moral agents. You've just imagined a world without people who can respond to reasons or values or moral considerations. So you're right. I think your intuition is right in saying that, morality would be impossible in that world. But it's not because there isn't value or obligations or reasons. It's because there's no agents.
Yeah. Well, I suppose
there would still be math, right? And so there would still be math in a world without humans. There just wouldn't be any agents to cognize mathematical truths.
I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure that there would be math. Like, it gets back into like whether math was created or discovered, and I'm not sure. I suppose more interestingly, though, real quick, like when this is another objection that I just completely dropped the ball and forgot to get into. I don't believe in free will, man. Like and it's obviously like ironically not by choice, right? Like I don't think I can't help it. And from my understanding of the science right now, like, there doesn't seem, certainly there isn't libertarian free will, and nor am I at all persuaded by compatibilist lines of thinking. Although I would like to be, because it would seem to be great. And so it's funny where I agree with Sam Harris with his criticism of compatibilism and his acceptance of determinism, but I disagree with him with respect to the way he doesn't think this is it's just a concern for morality. And I suppose you brought up moral agents. So do you believe in free will? And if not, what does it even mean to say agent in that case? And is agent even a really good, is it even an appropriate term for what we're talking about? Does that make sense? Moral robots perhaps might be just as appropriate.
So we could have a conversation on just this topic for an entire episode, plus some. A lot of ink's been spilled on this paper, and my position is by no means obvious, and I would encourage people to research it on their own, but I am a compatibilist when it comes to free will. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that we can have a sense of free will in which there's a perfectly coherent sense of we could have done otherwise, and that sense of we could have done otherwise is compatible with the truth of determinism, which is the truth that there's a causal process, the causal chain is unbroken.
And so when you say we could have done otherwise, you just mean to say that the circumstances could have been different such that something else could have happened?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so we can look at past behaviors in order to improve our future behaviors. So we're free in a way that no bird is free. So it used to be the case that an asteroid heading towards the Earth is going to hit the Earth and there's going to be a massive extinction. And in fact, that did. It killed the dinosaurs. But now that's not necessarily true because we're here. So we could potentially go out and Bruce Willis it and blow up an asteroid that's going to hit us. I mean, we could. I mean, granted, that's a huge engineering feat. It would be very difficult, but we could, in principle, do that. Well, so
we would just need to send a bunch of people that work on an oil rig, right? I mean, that would...
Exactly. We just yank them up at random and send them up there and just blow up the asteroid. But so what changed? What changed in the time from the dinosaurs to the time of us? What happened? Well, freedom evolved. We evolved a sense of freedom. We're free in a way that no dinosaur was free. We can look into possible states of affairs in the future and predict what certain outcomes will be, and then take steps now to change those courses in any way we see fit. So in that, I think that's the essence of free will. That's the free will that we have, but I think that's the free will worth having. So that's the only kind of free will we need to be morally responsible. So I agree with Kant when he says that ought implies can. If it's the case that I ought to do something, it's because I can do it. I have the ability to do that.
Well, it's almost like you should say ought implies could. I'm just kidding.
It's certainly something to think about.
Because it's not so much that you can, right? Like it's more like it could have been otherwise that you did something differently if the chain of causal events would have been different.
But so in that sense, I can be blameworthy for my actions in the sense that had I done so and so, well, I would have acted better or I would have acted worse.
But I'm sorry. I'm not sure. Like, I don't see how you could be blameworthy if we're all we're saying by you being free is that there could have been a different set of circumstances that brought you to that specific thing. Like, I don't. You're right though. I mean, I think this is not at the end of an hour-long discussion is not the time to get into compatibilism, and so that's my bad. But you said agent, and I was curious because I had forgotten to get into it.
So we can take non-moral examples too and see kind of the implausibility of this, because if what you're saying is the case, then no grade that we've ever gotten on a test we've never been blameworthy for. That's just the way it was. And so I think a lot of people, so right there, I think the confusion comes because people confuse determinism with fatalism.
Well, I admit that would suck.
So I
think much that's obviously false.
Well, we should move on though, because free will conversations can get very, very in depth. And,
Benjamin, I wanted you to convince me of more realism and the existence of free will. Damn it!
In an hour.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, Charlie, I am a compatibilist about free will, and I freely admit that view is not obvious. It's not self-evident. It requires argumentation.
And would you also say that you have to, you have to have that. I mean, you have to be a compatibilist, because if not, then Go ahead.
If I have to hang on to the belief that ought implies can, then you're right. But notice Sam Harris didn't do that move.
Right.
He was like, well, ought doesn't imply can. He's like, look, determinism's true. We don't have free will, but that doesn't matter. So I think Sam Harris is a compatibilist in everything but name. So I think Dennett is right in his criticisms of Harris on this point.
Ooh, man,
I think that their interaction is great, and everyone should go read it and make up their own minds. But I think that this is where Dennett really gets Harris. I think he's right in saying that Harris, that he's like, look, moral responsibility and determinism are compatible on Harris's view. In that sense, he is a compatibilist. And so
but that's a different type. Okay, but yeah, for sure. I mean,
so it's not free will in libertarianism.
Compatibilism in the sense that you have free will and or rather that you have a sort of choice and yet it's determined is different than saying, that it's determined and yet it's still you have moral responsibility. But if that's obviously that, and so that's fair. I just think that's easily confused though, because I would just when I say compatibilism.
And this is a bold claim that I would have to defend, is that at the end of the day, Harris and Dennett's disagreement is purely semantic.
If you appreciate the content and tone of what Real Atheology has to offer, please consider writing a review of the show on iTunes or contributing a modest amount per episode to the Real Atheology Patreon. Real Atheology wants to thank the following patrons: Matt Smith, Matt Yellen, Richard Kane, Jeremy Sears, Brandon McCleary, John Danaher of philosophicaldisquisitions.blogspot.com, Jason McElwetta, Evan Wirtz, St. Nimbus, Bob April, and Alexander Songe. Thank you for listening.